Dragon Age the Veilguard has been out for 2 months now, and in that time, I've not only played through it, I've started multiple playthroughs to experiment with the variations in combat styles and the various factions. And I have to say, it sucks. It sucks that not enough people will give this a chance, whether it's because they are ride or die for Origins, or they think it's too woke. Because this game is actually half decent. But perhaps the most unfortunate reason that's actually valid might be because of an inherent issue I had with the game that ultimately led to its downfall. But we'll get more into that in a moment. Since it's been a while, a lot of the first impressions and visceral reactions from it that people had going in, and even before, have started to die down. What I mean by this is that people immediately decided to jump on the hate train, and it feels like this is a common occurrence for every Dragon Age release. It typically gets a certain crowd and a certain number of people from the fanbase hating on it. Why is that? Because the fact of the matter is, Dragon Age is a series that is, and always has been, constantly changing. It's never just been one thing. If we look back at Dragon Age Origins to Dragon Age 2 and then Inquisition, it is clear that there have been a number of fans that absolutely disliked the direction that the series was going in, because it wasn't like the last game. And as I've talked about in my retrospective for Dragon Age Inquisition, I've mentioned that Dragon Age Origins is heralded by so many, and it can never be outdone, and Dragon Age has never reached that height. And perhaps it may be true. It might never have, and perhaps never will. But it also doesn't have to. Part of the hate, however, seems to have existed well before the game's release, dating back to its trailers. Honestly, I never understood some of the criticism surrounding them. While many people enjoyed the launch trailer and a few of the newer ones closer to the release, there were a couple that faced backlash. Personally, I didn't see anything wrong with them. I think a major issue people had going into this game was the expectation that it was going to be more of the same. But Dragon Age has always worked differently with each installment. But one of the most notable differences with its entry, even on the surface, is its art style. And to be honest, I actually kinda like it. Sure, it has a bit of a Disney vibe or aesthetic, which might not appeal to everyone, but for me, it kinda makes the game stand out. It's more unique compared to the typical photorealistic high fantasy settings that we've seen so often. That said, whether the art style resonates with you or not, the bigger question is this: is the game itself good? Is the story well written? Are the characters compelling? Is the gameplay engaging? These are the things that need to be judged on their own merit. And while there's definitely things that work here, this game strays far from perfect. Let's start from the beginning. From the very moment that you open the game, you are thrust into the character creation. And it's actually pretty robust, but also in some ways a little too limited for my liking. When creating my Rook, I didn't really mind it. All the settings were fine, because usually when I create a character, I kind of go for maybe just a slight alteration of one of the presets if I think they look good enough. I don't really like to change it up too much because, I'm just not the kind of person who likes to sit in character creators as much as some other people do. And typically, they do a better job than I could ever do. But for example, with Shepard in Mass Effect, I usually just go with the default version of the character, because that's the one that you see in all the promotional material, from the posters to the box, and in my head, it's also just the best designed anything outside of it. And when you start to make a custom version of them, it looks a little funky, and it's not my vibe. However, Dragon Age games are a little different. They do offer a bit more customization, and they actually look pretty good, no matter what you do. So generally speaking, you're gonna have a pretty decent looking character to play as. Like, you're gonna have to go out of your way to make him look a little, odd. Now, so for Rook, I didn't mind it, but the problem really boiled down to my Inquisitor. Now, for those who are also Sims players, this isn't really going to be an issue, because you already really like playing with character creation, and you know exactly what you're doing, and you really know how to customize every little detail. But for me, as someone who isn't great with this, remaking my Inquisitor to match the one from Inquisition was quite a struggle. Understanding exact proportions of the eye or the jawline is just not my forte. But at the very least, the hair options should be similar, and for some, that may be the case, but I personally couldn't find any options that fit my semi-short hair Inquisitor either. Like, you can't tell me that these two are the same person. But I just wish they included the same or more similar options for hairstyles, at least, that were in Inquisition. At the end of the day, it's not a huge deal, but it is a little immersion breaking when my Inquisitor has been basically recast. But beyond this, I think a lot of people will enjoy the character creator here. It's not quite as robust as, say, maybe Baldur's Gate 3, but it's a pretty decent one, for most people anyway. The game itself opens up really strong, actually, with Solas tending to the Veil and our good old friend Varric trying to talk him down. Obviously, that doesn't go over too well, because even though we do disrupt Solas, he also ends up knocking some of us out and leaving us a little injured and needing to retreat to our main base for operations. the Lighthouse. Now, the Lighthouse is actually a decently sized HQ for you to explore, and it might somewhat kind of remind you of the Normandy in Mass Effect, which I will be drawing a lot of parallels from, because obviously, not only is this a Bioware game, but this in particular, because it's very much like Mass Effect 2 in a lot of ways, and you've probably heard a lot about that. The setup, the structure, the companions you meet, it's all very similar, and not unlike Horizon Forbidden West either. But at the same time, Veilguard is also not like Mass Effect 2 in several key areas. So, in case you were wondering, this isn't exactly Dragon Age's Mass Effect 2 moment in terms of its writing, just some of the vibes and the plot structure. But yes, the game does share some similarities and there are parallels to be drawn, it's just not to that caliber in my opinion. That doesn't make it bad, mind you, just not as good. Though if I were to actually compare and contrast this game, I would say it's actually the antithesis to Baldur's Gate 3. And I say this because you probably have at least heard, if you have not played Baldur's Gate 3, that the first 2 acts are amazing. They're incredible. And while I still liked the third act of Baldur's Gate 3, it felt like it severely hurt the pacing of the game. Like the first 2 were super well paced. It didn't spend too little or too much time in each section, building to a conclusion left by a cliffhanger at the end of the second act. And then in the third act, they just shoved all the companion quests and additional side quests and all the other content right at the end where tension should be at an all-time high. Personally, I think that if they had spaced out some of the side quests and companion quests throughout the 3 acts, it would have been much better paced. But hey, that's just me. But I say that this is the antithesis to the Veilguard because it has the opposite issue. Instead of the first 2 acts being the best and the third one being the weakest, it's actually the first 2 that are the weakest, and it's the last act that it's at the strongest. The first 2 really demand a ton of patience from you, at least in my opinion, because it's also a little too slow plot-wise. The first act especially is a true test of patience because of how slow it moves, and it takes a while for it to really get the ball rolling. That's pretty much my biggest complaint. It's not the dialogue that so many would lead you to believe, because it really isn't that bad. It's just that we're biased to what came before. Love it or hate it, it isn't much different to the previous games. The reason people feel this way is because they either just had a poor perception going into it from what they've heard and seen, or the bigger issue, struggling to connect with the companions. That was a massive hurdle for me. I always say that characters often go hand in hand with the narrative, and having well-written and well-developed characters can significantly enhance the plot, and can be the factor that makes or breaks it. But usually, spending time developing supporting characters and their arcs pushes the story forward, and not only helps you care about them, but connects you to the story and its world. It ties it all together. It's what something like Hellblade 2, in my opinion, severely lacked when I played it earlier this year. However, while characterization is massively important, it's also important to strike a careful balance with the game's overall narrative. Depending on the type of game it is, the character should not overshadow the plot, and Dragon Age: The Veilguard is an example of this. Are the characters poorly written? No. Is the dialogue? Also no. But what severely hurt the pacing was all the focus on the companion quests. Sure, I love companion quests and I love exploring the development of these characters, but when so much time is trying to tackle these, the sense of urgency declines. And no, I don't mean the kind where you need to find your daughter and stop the wild hunt, but putting it on hold for Gwent.
Round of Gwent? You play Gwent, don't you?
But this is where it differs from something like Mass Effect 2. Because Mass Effect felt like that there was an impending doom, and the party Shepard needs to gather is there to help stop it. But in order to earn their loyalty, Shepard needs to help them out in their own personal companion quests, or loyalty missions as they're called. The difference here is that there aren't so many of them that it feels like it's detracting from the main plot. In the Veilguard, after what feels like every main quest, there is a new set of companion quests to tackle. Of course, you don't need to technically do them all right away, but that's where another huge issue lies. You do not know how long you have to complete those quests if you plan on doing them. You could actually automatically fail some without realizing or knowing which quest specifically could cause it. Of course, it makes sense that it would happen at certain points, so it's important to do as many as you can. But it gets to a point where you have no idea which ones will fail and which ones you won't, because the quest log is also kind of baffling to me. It gives you a list of active quests and organizes them pretty neatly into categories like most do, and then it also has a section of completed quests. But the problem is that when you're looking through a guide, for example, to see which quests you need to complete before proceeding forward in fear of failing them, it's incredibly hard to track, as the completed log doesn't always actually update. I know this because there are some quests I will just complete and move to the log to see if they've been added, but they're just not there. It's as if they don't exist. And without knowing this and remembering the titles of every quest that you completed, one may think that they either auto-failed it or just never came across said quest. Even a simple warning of some sort would have been nice, but the whole thing results in stressing out about completing as much side content as possible before proceeding on with the main story, which feels like it's taking a back seat in a game where the stakes are arguably higher than ever before. I mean, you're dealing with elven gods, but yet Corypheus felt like a bigger threat. And so, ironically, doing so many of the quests for companions felt more like I was playing therapist than friend, trying to sort out all their issues. Again, don't get me wrong, I think the stories are good and well written, but the balance just really took a toll on the experience, resulting in me not caring about them as much as I did. At least not for the first 2 acts anyway. But allow me to dive a little deeper. Veilguard has an interesting cast of characters, from the butler from Gardenscapes who really loves dead bodies to a coffee-loving Antonio Banderas. But the 2 best characters aren't even technically companions. They're companions to the companions. And that is our lovable Manfred, a friendly skeleton voiced by Matt Mercer, and Asan, a baby griffin, aka the best boy. But as far as actual companions go, I can't stress enough how stale their arcs are for most of the game. Towards the end of their arcs, they do get more compelling, and that's kinda where you start to care about them more, especially when they tie directly more towards the plot in Act 3. However, for majority of the game, because it's taking away from the main plot, and it's all about them, I realize that this is a significant reason why I really struggle to connect with them. Because a significant portion of their arcs are really just about trying to solve their problems, and really, Rook is nothing more than a problem solver. A yes man. And every conversation for a lot of it is always about, hey, I have this new quest for you to do, or when are we gonna go? When are we gonna go do it? Feels a little bit like this.
SpongeBob! I'm glad I caught you.
Like, I get it. Games have always had systems like this where you need to help someone before they can help you save the world, which is also saving them, ironically. But anyway, that's just how video games are. Sure. But in this game, it's also much more of that. It feels so much more like focusing on their problems than anything else. And nothing paints a picture like this more than this scene, where the team comes back from doing a main quest that they fail, but they draw the conclusion that it's because they're distracted. Why are they distracted? Well, because they are focusing too much on their own problems, and instead of being like, hey, we're focusing too much on our own problems, and trying to save the world for the betterment of everybody, including themselves, they say, no, we need to put the world-ending stuff on hold until we solve our own problems. But not by ourselves, mind you. And it's like I said, it's to do with the sheer number of quests and how often that you talk to them and how often it's just about them. There is no sort of line of questioning or investigation to build a better bond between Rook and their companions. It's mostly just about needing help. And it's particularly evident in that very scene, where they then proceed to list off all of their issues.
I've been preoccupied myself after discovering that hand of glory.
And I can't stop worrying about my new magic and what it means.
Or what the Venatori are up to in Docktown.
Act 3 is where things finally picked up and swung into full motion. The balance between the character arcs and the main story felt a hell of a lot better. And it was at that point when I grew to actually care about them more so. But a lot of the heavy lifting, narratively, doesn't even stem from the game itself, but rather the characters and the setup from Inquisition. From Varric to the Inquisitor, Morrigan, who appears in every single one of the games, and of course, the Dreadwolf himself. And it's these elements that really pushed most of the things I loved about this game forward, which is another thing I found strange, as the questline known as Regrets of the Dreadwolf was honestly far more essential than the quest logs would have you think. It's something that I kind of forgot about for a significant portion of the game, as it's placed near the bottom. But it should really be highlighted more, as it's something I consider to be essential not only to Solas' arc, but then by extension, the main plot of the game. So my advice, do not ignore these, as they're not only crucial to your understanding, and some of the best written parts, but I suspect that you would struggle to unlock the best ending. But speaking of ending, as I always say, it really is about how it finishes, how it all ends, how it all comes together, and how it makes you feel. By the time the credits roll, I feel like that is one of the largest determining factors as to how I feel about a game. As I've said, the last few hours of the game are done really well, and I kind of wish that they maintained that level of quality throughout, but I'm just happy that by the end, it came together neatly wrapped with a bow on top. Either way, it's mainly because of the pacing that I find really difficult to recommend this game. It's a bit like when your friend recommends you a show, and then you tell them the first few episodes struggle to grip you, and then they go, oh, episode 20 is where it starts getting good. Like, no. I should be able to like the game within the first few hours. First impressions matter. Now, that's not to say that this game is bad by any means, nor am I saying that the beginning is weak. In fact, as I said, the opening section is strong. But after that, everything else in between can get pretty stale, pretty quickly. And it's not until the ending where it's really at its strongest. Now, I know I've been pretty critical, and it might seem like I'm just tearing this game apart, and will continue to seem that way for the remainder of the review. So let me be clear. I do like this game. As I've said, the ending impacts the way I feel a lot of the time because it is your last impression, and I will say it hit, but they did a really great job. But I wanted to make it clear that I do like this game, because I also understand that it's easy to criticize something and pinpoint the negatives. But there's actually some decent and heartfelt things in here. It's just especially hard to describe exactly what when you're also trying to avoid spoilers. Though I will say that some of the best moments aside from Solas' story actually do come from some companions. But again, as I've said several times already, that's only really in the third act. Many of the characters actually finally come to terms with their reality and their resolve and learning who they are, and it finally ties itself to the plot. What goes from repetitive side quests and lighting candles, riveting, turns into some really well crafted and beautiful story. Though I suspect there are a lot of people who love their arcs throughout, and were less concerned about the main plot and where it takes you. I guess your liking will really depend on whether or not it's about the destination more than the journey, or the journey more than the destination. I'm not gonna lie, it took a lot to get there, and the only reason I continued playing was, for one, just wanting to see how it all wraps up and comes to a head, and two, the gameplay, specifically combat. Now, my first impression of the combat was just how fluid and fun it was, especially when you compare it to other games. It's far more flashy, and it feels more like a traditional hack and slash, one that feels fast and fluid. Every swing and dodge feels great. And initially, this seems like this is the area where the game excels the most. But the more you play, it actually becomes the weakest part of the game, at least the more you approach the end. Because as I mentioned, the pacing in the game itself is really slow, but part of what plays into this is the repetitive nature of the quests and how little variation there is within them. And so a significant part of it is due to the combat and having to essentially rinse and repeat to the point where it becomes a little mind-numbing. As a rogue, most of the time was just spent dodge rolling. It was nice to have him throw in some attacks and just to have this fluid, fast-paced combat where I could just hack and slash my way through and use certain abilities, but after a while, it just felt all very samey, and it just felt like most of my time was spent dodging. Yes, using my archery skills to target their heads and go for headshots was really nice and satisfying, but swordplay just became a little too much. Now I cannot speak too much for the other two, though I have tried them for new playthroughs, just to see how they are. I have no intention of doing full playthroughs with them, but I did play several hours with them just to see how they differ. At first, moving from one playthrough to the other can make it feel a bit more refreshing, knowing that you have a new set of abilities. Going from rogue to mage and then mage to warrior did keep things fresh, and they all felt awesome to play. Mage especially made certain enemies feel a lot less spongy, just as when you use arrows as a rogue, and you can take down a lot of health with them. But again, even with certain combat elements having a slight edge over the other, the locations, the enemy variety, and the mission types will always inevitably make it feel slow, boring, and overdone, especially when you hit the 35 to 40 hour mark. That's where you'll feel the really slow burn in progression, and the whole thing just adds to the slow nature of the rest of the game. Maybe you may have more patience depending on who you are, but personally, I was pretty burnt out and tired by then. I mean, by the end of the game, I felt like I had spent nearly 80 hours. But to my surprise, it was only 53. Now on the other hand, I figured it's possible that I'm just burnt out of RPGs since I've played so many of them this year, from Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Persona 3 Reload, Metaphor Refantatio, to a second playthrough of The Outer Worlds. But afterwards, I replayed both Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West, and now I'm currently on my third playthrough of The Witcher 3. So I doubt it's that. It's just the gameplay structure, really. One of the standout features of the game is its difficulty customization. While it's not an inherently hard game, the variety of options available allows players to tailor the challenge to their liking. There are 5 preset difficulty levels to choose from, along with a custom mode that lets you tweak individual settings. This flexibility is always welcome, catering to both casual players and those seeking a little bit more of an intense challenge. I found the custom settings particularly useful when fighting dragons. These battles are undoubtedly thrilling, but dragons can feel spongy at times. So lowering it does help, but take what I say with a grain of salt here because, as you all know, I suck at video games. What immediately catches the eye for many is the art style. While it hasn't been universally embraced by fans, I personally find it charming in its own way. It's not my favorite, and it's certainly a departure from the previous entries, but there's something distinct about it that sets it apart from other fantasy RPGs. Admittedly, it leans into a semi-Disney or Overwatch aesthetic, which can feel like a bold, if divisive choice for a series known for its grittier, more grounded tone. That said, the visual direction gives this game a unique flair, even if some may argue it doesn't scream Dragon Age. Though the Qunari, they could use some work. The environments, on the other hand, are undeniably stunning. The interplay of the art direction with the environmental design creates some truly breathtaking landscapes. Even areas like the Crossroads are brought to life with a level of detail and atmosphere that keeps them visually engaging. BioWare has done an excellent job in capturing the essence of a living, breathing world, and the aesthetic choices feel cohesive and deliberate. When it comes to level design, things are a bit more mixed. Navigation is certainly better than it was in Inquisition, and moving through the world feels less cumbersome overall. However, puzzles scattered throughout the world can feel a bit functional. They remind me of the puzzles in God of War Ragnarok. They're fine for what they are, and they do the job, but they're not especially challenging or inventive. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as they help break up the gameplay, but they can start to feel a little monotonous after a while. It's not a huge complaint, and the puzzles certainly don't detract from the experience in any major way, but still, they represent a bit of a missed opportunity to add more depth and intrigue to the world. The difference between this and Ragnarok is that at least in Ragnarok, it has much more that held it together. Meanwhile, while this can be forgiven, it's just another aspect that I wish could have been crafted better. Honestly, at least if there was one thing I would have immediately thought this game should excel at, it would be this soundtrack, because it wasn't scored by just anyone, but Lorne Balfe, known for Mission Impossible, and Hans freaking Zimmer. So, easy goal, right? No. Somehow, even with these two industry veterans, the game, while not bad, manages to sound a bit generic and barely memorable. There's nothing that really stands out here. I mean, there's moments where you'll hear a little bit of what sounds like The Dark Knight for obvious reasons, but that's about it, and it's a real shame. But at least this could win an award for Best Hair Physics, if there was one. Again, since I'm down this game a lot, there are some positives I wanted to highlight as well. An improvement, at least over Inquisition, was the addition of transmogs, which I know is just a standard by now, but I'm just glad that this feature was added. It's really nice not having to worry about the different armor sets that don't fit the aesthetic that you're going for, and instead being able to just apply whatever armor you think looks best. It's a little unfortunate that you can't do it on the fly, like in Assassin's Creed games, through the menu options, but at least the option is there when you visit your wardrobe in your room. Since I pre-ordered this, I got some classic armor sets that I decided to use at the end, as if my rook had to earn those. The N7 armor they dropped for N7 Day was pretty awesome too. Though, on the subject of appearance change, if you aren't totally satisfied with how your rook looks, you can always visit the room Varric's staying in and use the mirror in there. Looks like they took some notes from Baldur's Gate 3. Also, while on the topic of armor, if you're wondering, you can visit the Caretaker where you can upgrade all your armor and weapons. And the more you upgrade the workshop, the more options you get. Same goes for any merchant you visit. If you upgrade their shop ranks, it not only gives you more in store, but also increases your allied strength, which is important to rank to at least 2 stars, preferably 3, in order to get them to aid you by the end. Other increases come from completing their faction quests, another thing that added to my total playtime. Oh, and another thing. Sorry, my ADHD brain is all over the place with side tangents, but choosing your faction at the beginning does impact your game to some degree, and it is something worth considering. Depending on what class you choose, there are certain types that are better than others. Grey Warden if you're a warrior, Shadow Dragons if you're a mage, and Veil Jumper if you're a rogue. But there definitely are perks to be had. Personally, I went with a Shadow Dragon rogue to begin with, and it didn't matter much. But if you're looking to add an extra potion, and don't want to just be limited to 3, consider choosing the Antivan Crows. On PC, from what I've heard, this game runs impressively well. BioWare seems to have put effort into optimizing the experience, which is refreshing to hear how many high-profile games have struggled on PC in recent years. However, like most games, I played this on PS5, and while it runs fine overall, it's not without a few quirks. Playing on performance mode prioritizes frame rate, which is great for smoother gameplay, but it does come with some visual trade-offs. Character models occasionally have a slight blur along the edges, and in certain light conditions, you might also notice a bit of ghosting, similar to what we saw in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth earlier this year. It's not something that you'll see everywhere, and in many locations it's subtle enough to ignore. However, in areas like Arlathan, where the environment is rich with detail and dynamic lighting, these issues are much more apparent. That said, you do get used to it after a while, and it's not so egregious that it breaks the immersion completely. Still, it's indicative of a broader trend in modern gaming, the challenge of optimizing for multiple platforms. Developers are often tasked with making games look and perform well across a wide range of hardware, and sometimes compromises are inevitable. It's worth mentioning that while these visual hiccups might be distracting at first, they don't detract from the overall experience too much. And compared to some of the more glaring technical issues we've seen in recent releases, this is relatively minor. Nevertheless, it's something to note, especially if you're someone who prefers a flawless visual presentation in your games. As usual, Digital Foundry's video will be linked below. At the end of the day, this game is a bit of a mixed bag, and ultimately, I can't in good faith recommend this game to most people. There are moments of brilliance, like the compelling narrative beats, stunning environments, and a strong ending that leaves a lasting impression. But those moments are few and far between, and even those highs are often set by pacing issues, repetitiveness, and a lack of urgency towards a world-ending threat. That's not to say it's without merit. Those who stick with it may find themselves rewarded for its emotional payoff. And of course, some players will absolutely love it from start to finish. That's the case for any game. But for most, the journey might feel a little too arduous to justify the destination. As someone who ultimately did enjoy the game by the end, I wish I could recommend it wholeheartedly. But the reality is, this is a title that demands a lot of patience, and something that not everyone will have, or should have, to fully appreciate it.